Benvenute e benvenuti a tutti a questa nuova edizione del Festival del Classico, un'edizione più vera che mai perché dopo il 2020 quest'anno torniamo in gran parte in presenza, vicini fisicamente, ma anche con grandi momenti in digitale per continuare ad essere quel circolo senza confini che siamo diventati durante la pandemia. Un'edizione più vera che mai perché anche per altri motivi, perché quest'anno il tema risponde perfettamente a quella definizione di classico che non ci stanchiamo di ripetere e che dobbiamo a Italo Calvino. Il classico è qualcosa che ha sempre e continua ad avere qualcosa da dire e soprattutto da dirci. Ebbene, il tema di quest'anno, che è una dicotomia, cioè schiavitù e libertà, crediamo che sia più attuale che mai. La schiavitù teoricamente non esiste più, ma esistono tante forme di schiavitù in questo mondo di oggi e soprattutto direi c'è un tema scottante di attualità che è quello della libertà, di capire quali sono i confini della libertà e qual è la vera definizione di questa virtù, di questo privilegio, di questa necessità che tutti abbiamo. A questo tema della schiavitù e della libertà si riferisce e viene interpretato con grande competenza e fascinazione da questa anteprima del festival che dobbiamo a una scrittrice che come poche altre ha il coraggio e la coerenza di cimentarsi con i classici, e cioè Madeleine Miller, che conosce i miti greci, in particolare la poesia omerica, come pochi altri. A lei quindi diamo ora la parola e apriamo le danze del Festival del Classico 2021.
Hello, I'm Madeline Miller, and I am so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much to the Fondazione Circolo dei Lettori for having me to their Festival del Classico. I am thrilled to get to speak with you today. I'm going to start by reading a very short passage from my novel, Circe. Circe in Greek mythology is infamous for turning Odysseus's men into pigs. She is a witch and also a goddess, but her witchcraft and her divinity are really distinct things. She's born a goddess, but she makes herself into a witch. This very short passage comes from towards the middle of the novel, after Circe has been exiled from her father's halls, landed on the magical island of Aiaia, developed her witchcraft, and started turning men into pigs. The he in this passage is Odysseus. He asked me once, "Why pigs?" We were seated before my hearth in our usual chairs. He liked the one draped in cowhide, with silver inlaid in its carvings. Sometimes he would rub the scrolling absently beneath his thumb. "Why not?" I said. He gave me a bare smile. "I mean it. I would like to know." I knew he meant it. He was not a pious man, but the seeking out of things hidden, this was his highest worship. There were answers in me. I felt them buried deep as last year's bulbs growing fat. Their roots tangled with those moments I had spent against the wall, when my lions were gone, and my spells shut up inside me. After I changed a crew, I would watch them scrabbling and crying in the sty, falling over each other, stupid with their horror. They hated it all, their newly voluptuous flesh, their delicate split trotters, their swollen bellies dragging in the earth's muck. It was a humiliation, a debasement. They were sick with longing for their hands, those appendages men use to mitigate the world. "Come," I would say to them. "It's not that bad. You should appreciate a pig's advantages. Mud slick and swift, they are hard to catch. Low to the ground, they cannot easily be knocked over. They are not like dogs. They do not need your love. They can thrive anywhere, on anything, scraps and trash. They look witless and dull, which lulls their enemies, but they are clever. They will remember your face. They never listened. The truth is, men make terrible pigs. I always like to start with a short reading because, of course, both Circe and my first novel, The Song of Achilles, were deeply inspired by the Homeric poems, by the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the Iliad and the Odyssey, although now we think of them as texts that are written down, they originally started from oral tradition. They were stories that were passed down and honed in front of audiences, with performer and audience both responding to each other. And so when I was writing this novel, I really wanted Circe's voice to feel very strong. And I wanted there to be sort of an oral component to it as I was working on it. So I was very grateful for my background in theater, because I feel like theater helped me to imagine Circe as if she were really telling her story in front of us, almost like a performance delivering, an epic poem. My interest in the classics began when I was a child. I first started loving the Iliad and the Odyssey because my mom read me little pieces of them as bedtime stories when I was around 5 and 6 years old. And I actually have a memory of her reading the very first line of the Iliad to me, "Sing, goddess of the destructive rage of Achilles," and just being completely hooked. I immediately wanted to know, who was this Achilles and why was he so angry? And I think part of what drew me to the stories then is the same thing that draws me to them now, which is that even though there are gods and monsters and prophecies and wild, larger than life adventures, they felt incredibly human. The characters felt incredibly flawed and real and complicated and oftentimes difficult. That I was used to, as a child, the word hero meaning someone who was a moral exemplar, someone who was virtuous. But that wasn't the type of hero that I saw in these stories. These were people who had tremendous gifts and also made terrible mistakes and caused a lot of destruction wherever they went. When I looked at the Odyssey, I think part of what I loved about it is how timeless the story can be. This is the story of an exhausted war veteran who is desperate to get home to his family. And when he finally gets home to his family, he finds that it's much harder to re-enter his old life than he thought it was going to be after 20 years away. Now, we could even sort of go a step further when we look at the Odyssey, and we can see the Odyssey as the story not in particular of a veteran, but of anyone who's out lost in the world. Odysseus wants his nostos, his homecoming. It's the Greek word. And, in English, we get the word nostalgia from that. Nost, homecoming, and algia, pain, the pang we feel when we miss being home. And I think that that feeling of being lost on the waves, of wondering whether or not you'll ever make it home to the people who love you, feeling like you're surrounded by dangers, that is one of the most timeless human experiences, I think. Even if the dangers are very small, even if it's a 5-year-old going off to school and wondering when is my parent coming to pick me up, that experience of sort of separation and longing to be reunited is so timeless. And yet, what I love about these stories is that even as we can identify them, they also function to me like kaleidoscopes. That, if we turn them just a little bit, we get a completely different view. Because at the same time that we see Odysseus as this underdog hero that we all feel bad for, he's got a brilliant wife, of course he wants to get home, we can also see him as a really brutal person who loses all of his soldiers on the way home. They all die, oftentimes because he has endangered them. We can look at the fact that some of the people who are instrumental in helping Odysseus be reunited with his family are themselves enslaved, and that their stories run right along beneath Odysseus's story, and that they themselves are denied Nostos. So even as this is a story of homecoming of Nostos, Odysseus returning home, these people who help him find his nostos themselves will never have a nostos. They have been taken from their families and will never return to them. And so I love that these texts are so incredibly rich that if you just keep turning that kaleidoscope, you can find new stories at the edges. You can sort of dig out contradictions, that they're not simple texts, although we teach them to children, which always kind of amazes me, as my mother did to me, but they're very endlessly complicated, just as we humans are. Now, after I fell in love with the Greek myths, I continued to, try to find every version of them I could. And I kept reading more and more and more. And I was very fortunate to learn Latin, to begin learning Latin. And I had a wonderful Latin teacher in high school who saw that I was completely obsessed with these stories. In high school, I started reading Virgil and the Aeneid, and I just fell head over heels. And then my Latin teacher offered to teach me Greek. So now I could read that first line of the Iliad in the Greek. And I remember being so overwhelmed and so struck by the absolutely incredible poetry, that before it had been the story and the characters that had really grabbed me. But then it was the poetry, it was the language and the sound and the beauty and the intricacy of the way that language moved. Now, after, continuing to love this stuff, at the same time that I was doing that, I was also feeling frustrated with it, because I couldn't help but notice that even as, these were incredibly exciting stories, that there were a lot of characters that were getting sidelined, in particular, the women of the stories. That, the women were oftentimes just names. They were this person's mother and this person's daughter and this person's wife. If their story was really exciting, they might get to die to motivate the male hero. There were a couple of the big villains, women like Medea or Clytemnestra, who wielded some power but then had to be punished for it by the end of their story, and who kind of caused destruction wherever they went. And I remember being so frustrated by that. And in particular, I was really frustrated by this figure of Circe. Now, I had first heard about her when I was a kid reading mythology, and I thought, a witch who turns men into pigs? That sounds interesting. And I read the Odyssey for the first time in English class when I was 13. And I was really excited for the Circe episode. I remember thinking, here finally is this strong, interesting, clearly very intelligent woman who is not punished for wielding power by the end of her story. And so I thought, this scene where she and Odysseus meet, she's turned his men into pigs. He's going to go confront her. They're going to have a battle of wits. It's going to be, really some clever banter back and forth. He's smart and complicated. She's smart and complicated. But if you've read the Odyssey, you know that what happens in the scene in the Odyssey is that Odysseus has been armed with some herbs that, hang on one second. I'm going to pause. I'm so sorry. Can you hear my daughter? Okay, great. I'm going to keep going. Awesome. She's far away, but she was just loud for a second. Okay. Odysseus has been armed with some herbs that Hermes, his ancestor and one of his patron gods, has given him, that has made him, that will make him immune to Circe's spells. So with these herbs, he goes to confront the witch. And Circe tries to turn him into a pig. It doesn't work. And then he pulls his sword on her and he threatens her. And she screams, falls to her knees, begs for mercy, and invites him into her bed in basically one speech. And I remember being absolutely furious about it. As a kid, I thought, that's it. That's all she gets. I, couldn't help but notice the phallic symbol of the sword. I couldn't help but notice that as a woman, she had to be literally put on her knees in front of Odysseus. And I understood, yes, of course, this is his story. He's the hero. She's the obstacle. He has to overcome her. But I just felt like, can't we keep the camera on her a little bit longer? We never even find out why she's turning men into pigs. It gets treated in sort of later literature as if like, well, women, that's just what they'll do. They'll turn you right into a pig if they have the chance. which is, first of all, very sexist, and second of all, really boring, because people do things for reasons. And so part of what I really felt myself yearning for is a greater understanding of the complexity, the psychology of all the women in the stories, but in particular Circe. So as I continued to study classics, I ended up, thanks to my Latin teacher, I now knew Greek. I went off to university and I began studying Latin and Greek very seriously. And I returned to Circe many more times as an older student. Now, as an older student, I noticed something completely different. I noticed that actually Circe had gotten what I felt like was a very unfairly bad reputation in later versions of her story, that she is often treated as one of those big villains like Medea and Clytemnestra. She's seen as the man-hater, the spider at the center of her web, luring men in. She's, kind of the femme fatale. And that was very interesting to me, because that is not the Circe that we get in Homer at all. That after that initial moment where, she kneels to Odysseus, they come to an understanding, they do in fact become lovers, and then she says to him, "I see that you and your men are exhausted. Stay on my island and heal as long as you need to." And he takes her up on it. And he stays on her island with his men for an entire year. And at the end of that year, he actually doesn't want to leave, which is really extraordinary, because I mentioned that Odysseus spends the whole Odyssey wanting his nostos, his homecoming. And so he's constantly sort of agitating to leave every place he goes, but not Circe's island. His men have to say, remember Penelope and remember Ithaca, are we going to get going? And he says, okay, yes, you're right. And he goes to Circe and he says, it's time for me to leave. And she says, great, here's what you need to know. You're going to have to call these the dead prophet out of the underworld and talk to him. You're going to have to go past all these monsters. And she starts giving him this incredibly specific witchy advice. She literally helps him with the sacrificial animals. She loads his ship with supplies. She offers all this valuable help. And as I read the section, I kept thinking, not only is she not a villain, she's actually one of the most helpful characters that he encounters in the entire Odyssey. And yet that part of her has sort of been forgotten. So I was very interested in that idea that, yes, she's frightening and she can definitely turn you into a pig, but she has this benevolent side, this healing side, this side that's interested in helping Odysseus. And then the final piece of the story that I was thinking about was the fact that I really, partially I wanted to dig into that psychology. One of my first questions as I was dealing with Circe is, why is she turning men into pigs? And that's a pretty extreme thing to do. Why might you start to do that? So what I did is I started reading the Odyssey very closely and thinking about that section and sort of going through and letting little bits of it kind of percolate in my mind. And then there were a couple of things that really jumped out. The first was that the Circe section in the Odyssey is actually narrated by Odysseus himself. And it's narrated to some people that he's trying to impress and get help from. And as soon as I realized that, I had always sort of known that, but I had to realize it as a writer. And when I realized it as a writer, I began to think, oh my goodness, I'm being invited into this story. Because Odysseus, as you may know, if you know his legends, he is the great liar of ancient literature. He's the spin master. He's the politician. It makes him a wonderful storyteller, but he definitely cannot be trusted. And when you start to think about the Circe episode as something that Odysseus is doing to make himself look good, oh, there was this terrifying witch and she totally got the jump on my men, but then I came and I tamed her, and then she threw herself at me and she was super hot and helpful. All of that is meant to make him look good. And so once I sort of realized that not only was Circe being hidden underneath sort of the male heroic tradition, which epic is, but she was also being hidden under the secondary layer of Odysseus, the self-aggrandizer. So I sort of thought, okay, Odysseus, you've had 3,000 years to tell your story. Now we're going to kind of, so it allowed me to push back a little bit at individual moments of the Odyssey. For example, my Circe does not kneel in my version. And it also allowed me to zero in on her perspective. And one of the things that I was really interested in was her witchcraft. because Circe, as a goddess, doesn't have very much power. We hear other goddesses sort of at her level, another nymph like Calypso in the Odyssey, complain about the double standard, that the male gods can do almost anything, but that they're constantly trying to limit the goddesses. And I thought, and yet here's Circe alone on her island turning men into pigs, and even Hermes seems a little nervous of her. How does that happen? And to me, the answer was witchcraft. And I loved that, divinity is sort of this power that, you snap your fingers and it happens. And she doesn't have very much of that power. But witchcraft is about study and hard work and trial and error. It's about expertise, passion, dedication, knowledge. It's knowing how to put the herbs together, when to dig up the herbs, what herbs do what words you say to combine. So as I began thinking about it, I realized, this is an art. And Circe is a witch, but she's also an artist, and this is her craft. And so another way into her story was to really focus on her journey towards finding her own voice as a witch and also as an artist, and that those two things really came together for me. Finally, I was really interested in this very small detail that we get in the Odyssey, where Circe is described as the dread goddess who speaks like a human. It's just one word in the Greek, audeasa, speaking like a human. And it's a little bit of a debated word as well. Scholars aren't totally sure exactly what it means, but because I was a novelist and not writing a paper about it, I got to choose. And so to me, speaking like a human came to I began to think, well, what would that be like to be born a god, but to speak like one of us, to grow up in the halls of these immortal beings, like her father, the sun god. And I started to think about, well, what is it like to speak like a god? And when the gods speak in the ancient material, the world shakes, but Circe speaks like one of us. And eventually that came to stand in for me for her empathy, her ability to connect with humanity, to feel for humanity, unlike the Greek gods who, let's face it, if we were going to diagnose them, we would call them sociopathic narcissists. Circe has the ability to want to reach out to humans and to others, to connect. And so her ability to speak like a human is really her empathy. So those were the things that were at the core of the story: her empathy, her witchcraft, reaching in and making her the subject of the story as opposed to the object of the story. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you all for being here. I am so, so grateful to the Foundation for inviting me, and I hope you have a wonderful time.